on to speed controls. Easy. Yeah, by a lot. Give me a break. We got a few here, a few sizes. This is a speed control hooked to a motor, which motors we're going to talk in a minute. Playing with the other camera here, so forgive me. So this is a Hobbywing XR10 Pro. This is one new in the box here, so you can check that out. This is what I consider to be a higher end 10 scale buggy racing speed control. Also used in the drag cars quite a bit. I got it in my drag Corvette over here behind us. This is probably my favorite speed control for the racing application, hands down. Tekin makes also great quality stuff, but I'm not really here to talk about brands. So speed controls, obviously there's quite a few ratings on those, and the same with servos. It depends on what you're putting it in. Definitely more of a spread on speed controls than there is servos. This one is considered for 10 scale racing. I have this one here is what comes in actually a Corrali car, which is a 1/8 scale bashing car.
Slightly larger.
Yep. So now that Tyler, yeah, larger. So usually the bigger the car, the bigger the speed control. I mean, that's basically what it boils down to. More amps, more voltage, bigger motors. So I'll let Tyler do a little bit talking, or Nolan here. Whoever wants to go. Talking basically what scale speed control and what scale speedo you put in it.
Well, so I guess for most of your 10 scale stuff, 10 scale is kind of a tricky thing too, because all the carpet cars we run are 10 scale.
Right. Correct.
They run 2-cell lithium, which is 7.4 volts nominal.
Right.
But a lot of basher stuff is 10th scale, but is running 3S and 4S and stuff like that. So it's a little bit trickier. But in general, when you're in the market for an ESC, you want to know what you have for batteries. So do you have what's the voltage of the battery? Is it a 2-cell, which would be 7.4 volts, or is it 3, which would be 11.1, et cetera, et cetera. So the higher the voltage, usually the beefier the ESC you need. And the same is true with how much or how hot of a motor you're going to put behind it. So if you're going to put a really crazy motor behind it, you need a speed control that can handle the current that motor is going to pull. It's kind of a rabbit hole, because when you increase voltage, you also increase RPM, which increases current draw as well. So basically, if you're putting something together that's going to be stupid fast, you better make sure you size your ESC correctly so that you don't pop it.
So we got a lot. So I just grabbed this Tekin one. Olin grabbed this one earlier because it's got a lot of specs on the back of it. So really, I ask, one, what's it going in, obviously, for scale-wise, but then what are you planning on doing with the car? Because that's pretty important. You're going to either run big batteries in it and go for speed, or you're running more conservative, you're looking to run the car longer. So we'll stick with the 1/10, 1/8 scale, because it's kind of what we got in front of us here. So this is an RX-8, which is considered a higher end racing speed control for 1/8 scale. Yep. And they list a bunch of specs on the back here, so I'll let you guys see that, and we'll kind of go over this because I think it'll segue us into a lot of things. So right off the bat, leading into it, it's got the BEC voltage, which is what we were talking about before with the servos. So a lot of speed controls have built-in BECs, which is going to allow you to turn from 6 volts, usually to 6 to 7.4 volts, to get more power out of your servo.
The BEC circuit is literally for feeding the servo and the receiver.
Correct.
It gives the receiver power so that it can see the radio, and it gives the servo power so it can act on the commands. That circuit is just for those two things.
Yeah, and so the BEC is one thing to take a look at, and then there is a motor limit. Most speed controls will have a motor limit either in turns or kV, which we'll talk more about when we talk about motors. But basically it's what the company has said, this speed control with this voltage can power this motor with no problems. I mean, it's going to build heat that if you're running it right on the edge. But if you're going to be running, say, I don't know, you got a 10 scale car and you're going to run a really fast motor in it, you may have to get like an 8 scale speed control to output the current.
Well, that's what a lot of the drag guys are finding, right?
Right, so a lot of the drag guys are running 10 scale, but they're running 8th scale speed control to a 1/10 scale motor because it's asking for so much amp draw that a 10 scale speed control is actually struggling a little bit. That being said, I do run a 10 scale speed control in my drag car, but albeit it is a $200 10 scale speeder. But really, it's going to come down to what motor you want to run and how much voltage you're going to be putting to it.
Yep.
Because most 10th scale motors, or speed controls, excuse me, will do 2 to 3 cell. And then most 8th scales will usually go to 4 to 6. And then there goes in the 5th scale, which usually goes 8 plus cell.
Mm-hmm. Oof.
Yeah, we're getting crazy. I did bring a big motor, so we'll check that out after. So you really got to know what scale you're putting it in, and then really what you're looking to do. If you're going for straight speed runs, you're going to put a massive motor in this thing, and it's going to draw all kinds of current. You're going to need a big speed control. Like this Tekin, for example, it has an amp draw with a 300 amp constant and a 1,000 amp burst.
So let's talk about that.
That's important.
When you're looking at those two ratings, the constant is exactly what it sounds like it means. It means that ESC can deliver that many amps. 300, was it 300 for this one?
Yeah, that's what it says here.
Or, 100 to 150 for like a 10th scale job. It means it can deliver that more or less indefinitely. If you don't think about the battery dying, it can deliver that happily with no overheating issues. It won't pop. It won't have, any heartburn. When it talks about peak or, surge or inrush, or there are different terms for it. That other number, which will always be higher, is a momentary number. So when you whack the throttle on a car, that is the highest demand that motor will pull from the ESC. And you'll see on a dyno, if you have one,
Check out the dyno video.
You'll see this peak, and then immediately after the peak, it'll the current draw will start to come back down. Mm-hmm. So that's the inrush. That's that peak number to kind of get through that initial of getting the car moving when you whack the throttle. And again, it's not something that you're going to live at. So don't use that number to then go size the motor. Well, I've got a 3.5 that's going to pull 450 amps or whatever it is. Use the continuous number. That's your safe number. The other one is kind of hard to quantify, to be honest.
And a lot of the guys dial back the burst or that initial peak power that they get right off the bat anyway, because if you don't, the car's not going to be controllable. So
right.
You have all that power, yes, but you can't put it to the pavement all at once because the tires are going to spin. So you got to be careful of that also. Just because you have that power doesn't mean you should use it right off the gate.
Right. So like in the full-scale drag racing world,
correct.
Use the illustration of like nitrous. You may have a 300 horsepower shot of nitrous on your car, but you're not, as soon as you get off the line, going to whack the car with 300 horse. You're going to spin the wheels. It's not going to be controllable.
Correct.
So when you pull that back, it's like guys run a nitrous controller on their cars where that 300 horsepower shot gradually ramps in over 3, 4, 5 seconds as you head down the strip.
Correct.
So that you can still maintain grip and hook and so forth. So that's cool. They're doing the same thing in the little cars.
Right. You guys are talking about like setting a profile inside the speed control for that.
Yeah, that's kind of going down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, so that's getting a little deep. So basically what they're talking about is a lot of these higher end speed controls have you can hook them to software and change the actual curve of power, which is nice. So that's something to consider too when you're looking, what you want to do with the speed control. We're talking drag racing. Because drag racing got pretty hot this year, and going back to the current, if sometimes say you have a 10 scale motor, sometimes when you whack it off the line, it's actually drawing too much current for a 10 scale speed control to handle it. So you might have to attach an 8 scale speed control to a 10 scale motor in order to handle that current limit. Because essentially what happens is when you hit that throttle initially, I call it hitting like a rev limiter, but it's really a current limiter. The speed control will actually only put out what it can put out. So the motor will actually make like a it'll like it hits like a rev limiter. The motor will like something like that. I see it a lot more, not so much with the drag racing, I see it more with speed running. When someone is doing speed runs and they're ringing out their motor, their speed control, full timing, boost, which is all programmable settings and certain speed controls. It's hitting basically that like 1,000 amps when we're talking about the RX-8. It's hitting that, and actually the speed control can't output any more, but the motor is asking for more.
Right.
So it's actually hitting a wall, and I get it. I hear it a lot from people where the car will actually like stutter at wide open throttle. Basically, the motor paired with that battery is asking for more power than the speed control can put to it.
Interesting.
So you have to keep in mind the amp draw of what you're trying to do. And I know that might be going over some people's heads, which I'm sorry. If you're coming in to look for a speed control to upgrade your car because it's not, your motor is asking for too much power, just go. I call it going +1 on the speed control.
Yeah.
Okay, so for me, like in my racing car, speed control wise, I have a Max 6, which is rated for 8 cell, but I run it on 4, sometimes 5 cell. So I'm pretty underrating the speed control, so it runs cooler. I'm never drawing the max amount of amps that it can put out. The car never stutters or shudders. It likes the power. So I've bought a bigger speed control than my motor is asking for power.
You've oversized the system.
Correct.
Basically, so you have that extra margin.
Yeah. So if you're always safer to get a bigger speed control than a smaller speed control. When in doubt, just get a bigger one.
Right.
And I mean, cost-wise, we're talking. I mean, these are high-end ones that we grabbed. I'll give you that. But this is an RX-8 for $220, and this is an RX-10 Pro, which is Hobby Wing, for $200. I believe this goes for, and $220. So this is a $20 difference. But this RX-8 will put out more amps than this RX-10. So just keep that in mind when you're shopping around. If you can afford to go a hair bigger and you got the space for it, you're always safe putting a bigger speed control with a smaller motor.
As long as the application warrants it.
And the car can fit it.
Right, because the speed control doesn't really care what motor it's pushing. You can put a little tiny motor with a massive speed control, as long as the speed control run on set, the voltage matches up.
Yep.
You go too crazy. You want a speed control this big and a motor this small. Within reason. But you could run an 8 scale speed control with a regular 10 scale motor, and the speed control will run cooler, and generally the motor will run a little bit cooler too because there's no restriction in amp draws or anything like that.
Well, and you'll see that sometimes, like with short course, you'll see two wheel drive short course trucks using a standard 10th scale 2-pole motor, like that X Factor there or whatever.
Yeah.
But they'll run an 8th scale ESC.
Right.
Because it's a big granted it's a 2-wheel drive truck, but it's bigger, it's heavier, so you run a speedo that can handle the current draw, and it's not going to overheat, it's not going to be grumpy or unhappy. They usually also have a slightly stronger BEC, so the bigger the size ESC, generally, the more power it can give the servo. So, going back to like the 4-wheel drive days with short course, guys were having issues where their ESCs would brown out because, like, the old Mambas couldn't provide enough power to the servo in a 4-wheel drive short course.
Right.
So again, this is where a bigger ESC, like you said, Olem, if you can fit it, it's not hurting you to have it in the car.
I do want to touch on the BEC real quickly. If you do turn your BEC up to 7.4 volts, you have to make sure your receiver can handle it.
Ooh, good point.
Because that gets glazed over a lot. A lot of ready-to-run trucks, receivers are rated for 6 volts. If you have an aftermarket radio, generally it's rated for 7.4, but you are going to want to check to make sure your receiver is rated for it.
Yeah, good point.
Because you will blow up the receiver, essentially. The servo, it may be fine, the speed control may be fine, but the little receiver everything gets plugged into may not be fine with it. So double check that. I get asked that one a lot. Just a little sidebar there. So check out your receiver and make sure that everything's going to jive at 7.4 volts. It should all be written down in the specs of your receiver.
And one other thing that we don't want to skip over is some motors are only censored and they can only run on a censored ESC.
Right, we got to talk about that.
Because if you try to run a censored motor on a non-censored ESC, you're going to have that clogging issue that you were referring to earlier.
The cogging, yeah, you're right. So we got to talk about censored and non-censored, which applies to ESCs and motors, but we're just going to talk about the speed control portion of it right now. So what Olin is saying, I don't know, I guess this Tekin is the easiest, I don't know.
This one's not censored, so...
Yeah, so this Tekin has this little port, just trying the best I can here to show you, on the side, which is a sensor port, which is essentially a wire that connects.
You can see it on that guy right there.
Yep.
Yeah, this is actually a better example. Thank you. So we got, let's see, this cable here is actually called a sensor cable, which is connected to the back of the speed control to the back of the motor. So the back of the motor has a sensor board, rightly named, and the speed control has a sensor board. And essentially, as far as I know, all this cable does is monitor where the rotor is inside of the motor. So essentially it starts up smoother because it applies power to the correct magnet in the motor so the rotor spins without cogging. So speaking of cogging, I guess we could explain cogging a little bit. I'll let Tyler talk about it because he's messing with motors and the dynos and whatnot. So what's
good.
cogging?
Oh,
What's
good.
cogging, Tyler?
Cogging is usually, so I'll describe what it is physically. It's usually manifest in the car when you give it some throttle, and instead of the car smoothly just taking off, you get this sort of cogging. It's this kind of notchy, jittery behavior where the car doesn't want to take off, and you can usually kind of work around it, like if you give the car a push. And as it's rolling, you get on the throttle. Once it gets past kind of an idle or a crawl, it tends to go away. It can be caused, by a bunch of different symptoms, but at the end of the day, it boils down to not having your motor and your ESC, assuming everything else is right, matched to each other. If the ESC is expecting to see this little cable, and it doesn't, it doesn't have the data it needs to drive the motor. And there are some ESCs that are censored only. There are some that are censored and sensorless. There are some that are sensorless only. Mm-hmm. So again, this gets back to if you're buying one of those two pieces, the motor or the ESC, know what the other one is. Correct. So that you can, when you come in, you can get the mating part right.
Yeah, let's see. I don't know if the speed control box says it. I know the motor box does.
Usually the high-end stuff will run sensorless, but what you'll find is it doesn't have the same amount of pop off the line. It'll feel soft, almost like turbo lag in a car. Because whenever somebody's sensor wire goes bad or their sensor board goes bad,
I call that the two-step.
Yeah.
Basically, you just hammer it full throttle, and the car will do like a.
Yep.
Basically, your car will feel like it has no torque at all off the line.
Yep.
And then it'll take off and go because the motor doesn't. No, excuse me. The speed control doesn't really know where the motor's at, so it's just throwing power at it, and then it figures it out and goes.
Right. Most of these ESCs have algorithms built into the software in them, where they can fire the pulse because you have your three legs, so it'll fire the three legs. And it's looking for, without going too deep into this, it's looking for feedback through the other unactivated legs. So it'll fire A and it'll watch B and C. And that's how it can tell whether it's rotating forward or backwards. That's why sometimes a sensorless setup, when you first get on the gas, I know I've seen some of the Traxxas cars do this, they'll sort of they'll burp and then they'll go. Right. If they're not totally happy. That's the ESC playing with the way it's firing the motor to get it to see the right rotation. And then once it sees it, it goes, okay, I got to go ACB, whatever the pattern is. So a lot of the ESCs are smart enough to figure that out, but they want to see what they're programmed to see. So if it's a censored ESC, plug the wire in if you have the right motor. If you don't, then you're kind of going to be
You
behind
need that wire plugged in. I get asked that one a lot. Do I need to plug in this wire? Yes. If it's a censored motor and a censored speed control, you need the sensor wire plugged in.
Right.
Otherwise, the car is going to have absolutely no bottom end, and you're going to wonder why it's so slow.
Yep. It's the speed feedback.
And if you have an uncensored system with uncensored motor, uncensored speed control, it is okay that it stutters when you're barely holding the throttle.
Yep.
And it does this.
Right.
That's perfectly normal because that's something brought up to me a lot as well. It's just the censored speed control in the motor gives you the smoothness. The uncensored is usually cheaper, which is why it's uncensored. And also usually has better water resistance being uncensored.
Well, because it's one less port to have to seal.
You don't have to cover up a port. So that's something to consider too, is actually being waterproof, to segue into that. An uncensored system, like I got this speed control here. This is just a basic ready to run speed control. It's uncensored. The only ports are the ones in the front and the one that goes to the speed control. This is considered a waterproof speed control. I think it's out of a Corrali car. Uncensored, just 3 pulls in, and that's it. There's no sensor port to cover up to try to make waterproof or anything like that.
Right.
So, censored and sensorless really has its place. One's not really better than the other, in my opinion. I think censored electronics are better on like a racing car.
Yeah.
Where taking off faster, smoother, or checking. You get to check more settings and parameters in the motor when there's a sensor board, like the dyno and whatnot.
Well, and that's what that sensor board is. What enables the ESC to give you adjustable timing, adjustable boost, and all these other things, because it lets the ESC know exactly what RPM and at what point to fire the different phases. So I think the sensorless ones, true or false, usually have less of those features.
Yeah, you can't
I
really.
think they have them.
Yeah.
So that's
sensorless.
then there you go.
Sensorless systems, you can't really see what's going on with the motor. It just doesn't know. It's only got power going to it.
Right.
Like with a censored system, like this Hobbywing system here with the Trinity motor. This is your typical 10-scale racing setup. This sensor wire will allow you, with the speed control, to actually see like the last motor temperature, the phase timing, and all kinds of fun stuff that is probably over some people's heads. But it gives you more information about the motor. But if you're just bashing around the yard, you probably you probably don't care about that stuff.
You're arguably worse off with a high-end censored system.
For sure.
Because most of your really powerful censored motors are like that Trinity, where I don't want that in a basher car. No. It's completely open and exposed. So they're serving two different legs of the hobby, which is fine. You know, if I have a basher, I just want something that's stupid fast, and I can pull the trigger and it goes in the direction I want it to.
That's what I'm and that's what I'm saying. It's like you can. This setup here is an easy $300, where you can get a equivalent speed, probably faster, for half the cost, uncensored.
Right.
And it'll be waterproof, just as fast, and
that.
probably take a bigger beating.
Correct.
So you got to know the application for the speed control that you're looking at. If you're bashing or racing, there's going to be better options for one or the other. Just to wrap up speed controls, you got to know what you're putting in to scale. If you're looking to get speed out of it, or torque, or there's crawling, just when you're coming up to the counter, I need a good speed control for a crawler or a 10-scale buggy. If the person working the counter has any idea what's going on, they should have a pretty good recommendation for what you need.
And this is how big my battery is.
Yeah.
This is how many volts I'm running.
I'm looking to run 6-cell in this car, or 3-cell. Your car may not be built for it, but you can put the electronics in it to make it do it sometimes. But the car not being built for it, that's a whole other show, I guess.
Yeah.
Some cars, you can't put 8S power into a 10-scale buggy. It's just not, within reason here. But anyway, that would be fun though. Olin will do it next.
Oh yeah, I've definitely done it.
No. But anyway, so that's mostly speed controls. There's current, your BEC voltage. We didn't even talk about brushed. All brushless. Most things are going brushless these days. Even crawling, the minis, everything's going brushless, and really all brushless. If you to know the difference between brushed and brushless, real quick, 3 wires, 2 wires. Brushless is 3 wires. Brushed has 2, which is positive and a negative. Okay. Brushed is really getting phased out. A few ready to run cars still coming with it, and it's still somewhat popular in the crawling scene. But brushless is coming in pretty fast there too. So pretty much just know what you're looking to get, and know what you're looking to put it in. What voltage, what car, what size, and just have a general idea of what you're looking to do. And don't be afraid to ask some questions about it, because I know it can be pretty overwhelming. There's a lot of different speed controls and a lot of different motors.
Yep.
And not everything has been tested together. There's combinations of speed controls and motors that may work in your car that maybe I haven't put in there yet. But there's definitely a lot of tested motors and speed controls.
Yeah.